All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of PON Live from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. I'm Nicole Bryant, the Managing Director here at the Program on Negotiation. And as ever, I am very pleased to be able to introduce today's session, which features a book talk on a new work, Forging Bonds in a Global Workplace. And before we introduce the work and its authors in just a few seconds, let me take a moment to welcome those who are new to our programming. So as many of you know, the Program on Negotiation has for 40 years now led the world in research, curriculum development, and executive education related to the fields of negotiation, mediation, and conflict resolution. And we are very delighted to continue the learning of our fabulous community coming in from all over the world, as we see in the chat, with this series of virtual events. Today's event will take place over the course of an hour. We will have about 40 minutes of discussion with our moderator and our authors. And at the conclusion, we will, of course, leave 20 minutes for questions from our audience. So as ever, throughout the program, if you have a comment, please feel free to put it in the chat. If you have a question, we'd ask that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen so that we can more accurately field all of those and so that everyone can see the different questions that come in. So with that and without any further ado, I'd like to thank the PON staff who always make these events so wonderful, Diane Long, Lindsay Sullivan especially, and to introduce the moderator of today's event, PON's longtime assistant director, James Kerwin. James has been serving at PON for the better part of 2 decades now, and you are in great hands. He's a former radio personality way back in the day, and it will be a wonderful host for this event. So I will turn over the virtual Zoom floor to our Assistant Director, James Kerwin. Thank you, James.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And also, it's fun to be in the anchor chair moderating this discussion, and really excited about this book, which I discovered on Amazon when it gave me an algorithm. So I want to introduce our speakers. Melissa Hahn is an intercultural consultant, trainer, and coach, as well as a university instructor. She earned her master's in intercultural relations from the University of the Pacific, and she is an adjunct faculty member at American University's School of International Service. Dr. Andy Molinsky is a professor at Brandeis University's International Business School. He earned his PhD in organizational behavior and his master's in psychology here at Harvard. He also holds a master's in international affairs from Columbia. He is the author of Global Dexterity and Reach. And today he and Melissa are going to talk to us about forging bonds in a global workforce. So welcome to both Melissa and to Andy.
Thanks for hosting, and we're really happy to be here.
Well, as I said, I discovered this book on Amazon. I'm a bookstore kind of guy and prefer to see books on the shelf, but this one really did jump out at me. And in the negotiation field, we really often talk about negotiation as being 3 things: substance, process, and relationship. And when we get to the relationship piece, one of the complicating factors is often culture. And so having this book, which you even describe at one point as a guide to building successful relationships across cultures, I think this is a real addition to people who are working in our field. And I'm very excited about the questions that we're going to have from our audience during the Q&A session. So I think I want to kick things off with a beginning question. I really enjoyed when I first started the book, and you kind of, from the get-go, you move beyond a focus of how we're different and saying that oftentimes in the past we were instructed to focus on differences. So I would love if you could talk a little bit about that premise.
Melissa, you want to start? Or?
Sure. So I do want to acknowledge that cultural differences can be real and they can be relevant. But oftentimes when I work with clients and students, what I find is that they get stuck at the difference They assume that memorizing the difference is the goal. And so they kind of go down this labyrinth of creating endless categories and charts in their mind. And then they don't know what to do next. And so I think what Andy and I wanted to do is say that, the differences can exist, but the differences aren't the means by which we actually establish a connection. And so we want to keep the fact in the back of our mind that the person we're working with may in fact be different from us. But if we want to connect with them, we need to move beyond that difference and look for ways that we might be similar or look for things that we have in common.
Yeah, I'd agree with Melissa for sure. Obviously, we wrote the book together. I mean, to be honest, I feel and I've always felt that the cross-cultural field is obsessed with differences. The many people in the audience, if you know a little bit about culture or cross-cultural, you've probably heard of Garrett Hofstede. Hofstede's, Dimensions of Cultures probably rings a bell to some people out there in the audience. And that's an approach that's very broad, very vague, and focused entirely on differences. When you're building relationships in your own culture, you're not focusing on differences. You're usually trying to you're maybe acknowledging them, but you're trying to discover commonalities. And I think that that's been lost in the cross-cultural world, and that's what we wanted to try to recapture in this book. Not to mention the fact that, as Melissa said, differences, like, if you talk about like differences between India and the US, I mean, how many people are in India and the US? I mean, those differences are averages, right? And there's tremendous variation across the mean. So I think it's a far too blunt approach for the sophisticated, interactions and negotiations that we have.
Well, speaking of interactions, we're often told that we should engage in small talk or, not necessarily cut to the chase right away in a business conversation. And you have a lot of advice about small talk, and I'd really like to turn the discussion over to some of that.
Do you want to take this one, Andy?
Sure, I'll kick it off. Small talk. So I have to say that small talk was something that came up so much in our interviews for this book. We interviewed about 75 professionals, maybe even more, maybe over 100 professionals across the world in terms of relationship building, and small talk kept coming up. I think our bias originally was that, small talk maybe was just like an American thing. It clearly is not an American thing. However, there are important variations across cultures, tendencies, let's say, across cultures that are important to take into account. So, for instance, and we could talk all day about small talk, but one of the aspects might be power. In certain cultures, it would be very, very uncommon, probably inappropriate, to approach someone who's above you in the hierarchy and to start small talk with them, which, by the way, gets people into trouble when they come here. Like my students from cultures like that, let's say, which are more hierarchically oriented cultures, and they come here to the US looking for jobs. They get a job, they're sitting in the mailroom, the CEO walks in or a senior manager comes in, and they freeze and they don't feel comfortable making small talk with them when that's a critical part of the networking process. So that's a cultural example. There are many other strategies that we talk about in the book about making small talk that seem to work mostly across cultures, I'd say, and we could talk about those too. But Melissa, anything you want to add on small talk?
Yeah, so one of the things that Andy and I wanted to address was what kind of approach is most likely to be successful when you are in a global environment where there are people from many different cultures who might be mingling, or when you're moving between cultures. You're negotiating with one culture today and another culture tomorrow. And what we found is that in those environments, verbal communication tends to be really important. If you are just immersing yourself, for example, in Japanese culture, maybe you wouldn't be making small talk the way that you would in the US. But if you are at a global networking event, you are there to communicate, you're there to engage, you're there to make connections. And so what we find is that even people who wouldn't necessarily rely on an American style small talk in their home country find it really useful to have some kind of formula, some kind of process that they can deploy when they know they need to make a lot of connections really quickly. They need to establish that spark and that rapport and that initial sense of trust kind of on the fly. And small talk can be really valuable in that setting.
I really liked how one of your subheads in a chapter was transforming small talk into real talk. And you advised using active listening, which is really something we do in the negotiation mediation world. And not only active listening, but you say listen to connect and ask open-ended questions. And that when I read that, I thought, oh, I've got to have these people on to have a discussion.
Yeah, so open-ended questions, I think that's a subtle trick that seems to work in a lot of cases. A closed-end question is a question that easily invites a yes or no answer. Like, let's say, James, did you like your trip? Did you like your trip to Mexico? And you might say, yeah,
That
it's
was
pretty
okay.
good. It was okay, right? But if I said, hey James, I heard you just got back from Mexico. Tell me about the trip. I'd love to hear about the trip. That's
Yeah.
an open-ended question. You can't say like it'd be very odd if you said no. So that invites you to share something. And the reason that that's important is because you are now getting data. You're getting information. You're getting potential things that you might be able to find a connection with or commonality, right? And then you might ask another open-ended question. I think that this process initially in small talk is to probe in a friendly, engaging way, to probe and to try to find something where you might have a connection that might bring the conversation down another path. And that's critical, I think, in sort of sowing the initial seeds of trust. And it seems to be something that people do across cultures, though there are, of course, these variations, like I talked about power, for instance, or there are other cultural elements that might come into play.
I think it also helps us to reduce the pressure on ourselves. When we're walking into a situation with somebody from another culture, we might think, okay, I have to memorize this other culture. I need to be ready with my script. But if we actually just turn it around and ask them and invite them to share something about themselves, now we don't have to memorize anything. Now we don't have to be 100% prepared with this very narrow interpretation of who we think they're going to be. We actually get to discover who they're going to be. And when people find us interesting, we want to engage with them. And so I think that's a really powerful trick that really kind of opens up the conversation and creates an opportunity to have that connection.
I should say, if it's okay, that I noticed in the chat that there are people from around the world, which is great. There might be someone from Germany listening in and saying, whoa, wait a second. Small talk's not as much a thing here in Germany, especially with people that you don't know. Or maybe someone from Korea who would say it's not a common part of the repertoire. And maybe there's someone from Brazil who might say, oh yeah, small talk. I mean, we can very easily move from something, meeting someone, to learning about their family in a split second. And then that weekend we're at a birthday party with them. It's like there are different cultural norms around privacy, around pacing, how fast something happens, and so on, for sure. Right. But I think when you are doing international negotiations, that's where what's important is not the fact necessarily where someone comes from, but what their life experience is, right? Is this person a local who has never stepped foot out of Germany, is German to the core, right? Or is this someone from Germany who did a semester abroad at Harvard, maybe has traveled a lot, maybe worked in other countries and cultures, maybe has more of a global mindset in a sense, and has picked up different norms, and their comfort zone has expanded over that time. That person's going to be very different from the former person. So I think that's important to consider as well.
Yeah, and you brought up in your book some of Michelle Gelfin's work from Northwestern on tight and loose cultures, and I found that very interesting. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
I can, Melissa, if you want, or you can.
Well, one of the things that we talk about in the book is also that, based on Michelle Gelfand's work, there's a notion that some cultures are very focused on the rules and the protocol, and they evaluate other people by how well they sort of adhere to those rules. And other people in other cultures are the opposite. And we see that in settings too. So in different situations, especially in negotiation, there might be moments that are very scripted and it's very important to stick to the protocol. But in other situations, you might have a lot more leeway, and so does the other person. And so trying to discern how much wiggle room you might have can allow you to see how much room there might be for experimentation in those contexts.
And I'll also add that it's not just the culture, right? I think going back to the earlier point, what's the organizational culture that we're operating in? What's the regional culture? What's the background of the person that I'm interacting with, right? All that's going to shape sort of the implied norms of the situation. So I think in the end, culture is like a hypothesis that you walk in with, ready to have it disconfirmed. But it does give you a way to kind of like potentially expect something.
So I guess when in Rome, do as the Romans do? Yes or no?
Ooh, I can take that one.
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
We can. I mean, and I'll just, and Melissa, please, chime in as well. I mean, I'll bring that back to my MBA class, where I teach global dexterity, my topic of one of my previous books. I would have very seasoned executives come into class to speak, and they would give their very best advice to the MBA students. And so an executive would come in and say, you know what, students, when in Rome, act like the Romans. That's what you got to do. And the students are like, oh, okay, that sounds great. Excellent. I know what I need to do. Next week, I have another executive come in, and the executive says, you know what? The key to crossing cultures, to being effective across cultures, is just be yourself. Just be yourself. And then the students are like, yeah, that makes sense. Well, wait a second. Like, they just told us when in Rome, act like the Romans. This person's telling us just be yourself. I think what Melissa and I would probably agree on is that it's a false dichotomy, and that there are ways that you can learn to adapt and adjust your behavior across cultures so that you are effective when in Rome, effective and appropriate, but that you do stay true to yourself as well, that you stay authentic to yourself as well. And that comes through learning to customize your behavior within the constraints of what's appropriate or normative in the new setting. But there's room oftentimes for you to simultaneously have your cake and eat it too, be effective and be yourself. So long-winded answer, but that's my answer. Melissa, do you have anything on that one?
Yeah, I would say, we all want to try to be successful when we're working with the Romans, for example, but the goal is not to out-Roman the Romans. It's not to be more Roman than the Romans and sort of impress them with how Roman we've spontaneously become. It's to find a way to work with the Romans. And that's often going to just naturally be a hybrid of who we already are and what seems to be working in that setting. So I think rather than trying to sort of copy them or perform as them, we want to be thinking, what will likely work with them? Test that out, and then maybe make some modifications and adjustments if your initial attempt doesn't seem to be working.
Well, great. Well, one of the things I really like about this book as well is some of the practical advice and stories. And you do a nice job of kind of reflecting at the end of chapters. You give thought exercises that I find very useful. And also you present a 6P framework for mastering the logic of relationship building. And one of your Harvard Business Review articles, Andy, had the 6P framework laid out. We're going to put that in chat, but I'm wondering if you could just kind of briefly lead us through the framework a bit.
Melissa, do you want to take that? And by the way, that
Sure.
article's a co-authored article, actually. It's Melissa and me together.
Oh, great.
But that's okay. Do you want to talk about the P's?
Sure.
I mean,
So
any framework, by the way, has to have things that start with the same letter. That's sort of a requirement for books, right?
although somebody did point out to us that in other languages, of course, they're not all going to start with
Good
the letter
point.
P. So we had to work with the language we were operating in. But the idea was that, many people these days are working with multiple cultures, and that the cognitive load of trying to memorize every culture that we might come into contact with is just unrealistic. We can't actually hold all of that information. But what we can do is try to integrate and sort of absorb a process that we can use, and we can know what clues to look for when we're meeting people from different cultures. And so what Andy and I came up with after talking to all of these global executives was the 6Ps. And the idea is that there are these 6 factors: power, purpose, place, privacy, pacing, and presence, that might be influential, might not, in a given situation. And if you can figure out what your own style is, which is influenced by your culture and also your personality and life experience, and you can get a sense for the setting and the other person. If there's areas where there's overlap, that's great. Those are things that you have in common. If there's areas where there are gaps, those might be the specific areas that you want to give the most attention and care to as you try to connect with that person.
You also do a lot of discussion around building global teams. And, I think that what was really interesting for me is this book is published this year in 2024. And it's one of the first books that I've read that's starting to incorporate some of the questions about how do we build rapport on Zoom? How do we deal with getting hybrid workers back into the office place? So I'm wondering about some of those relationship building challenges that we have post-COVID.
Fun fact, Melissa and I have written a book together. We run a training certification program together. We've written multiple HBR, Harvard Business Review articles together, and we've never met in person. Which is sort of an interesting backdrop to the fact that I think that you can build, trusting relationships. We will at some point. It's not like some forced thing, but you can build trusting relationships virtually. I think a lot of times people would probably agree that a lot of work is hybrid, so that you're meeting people in person, ideally it could be once period, it could be once every now and then, it could be once a week, and so on. So you're flipping between hybrid and personal. I think that there are a lot of ways that there's two different factors there. There's virtual and there's global distributed, right? So oftentimes those things come together. There are many different tips that you can use. I can mention a few. Melissa, maybe you can mention a few if you'd like. I think that leveling the playing field is really important in terms of time and distance. The simplest one is scheduling. I think we were talking yesterday, I think maybe about how Eastern Standard Time seems to have some sort of like power in the world hierarchy, that everything is related to that. And Melissa's on Pacific Time, and she sometimes, people just don't think about it as much. And if you can imagine a global team where people are in the US and people are in India, let's say, and so all the meetings are scheduled just sort of by default, not in some duplicitous way, but just sort of like almost like a mindless way to accommodate the Eastern Standard Time when it becomes incredibly inconvenient in Asia and India, wherever it might be. So that would be something just to pay attention, because what you're trying to do ultimately is show it's the meta message that matters, right? It's that you value the person, you respect the person, you value yourself, but you also value the other person, and that could be an important accommodation. I think that making virtual communication count, trying to build personal check-ins into your virtual communication. I think video provides a richer experience. As if people watching me, you can see me smile right now, right? Well, you're seeing a lot of people say that nonverbal communication accounts for some very large part of communication. I think that's debatable exactly how much. Let's say certainly it's over 50%, let's say. Some people say it's like 90%. Anyways, it counts, right? It counts. And I think that by having video on, you can sort of gain, you're sending a much richer set of communications, which, by the way, could also be misinterpreted as well. That's part of the problem. So if you're building the trust offline and online, and once you have that trust, then those mistakes don't become as damaging, let's say, because you're having that opportunity to build trust. I could go on and on, but there's many different tactics and techniques you can use. Melissa, you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, let's say one of the most important things is to be intentional. The virtual relationship is not going to have as many opportunities for spontaneous interaction as you would have in an office, because there's no physical water cooler. You're never going to accidentally bump into each other if you don't have a Zoom meeting or you're not communicating on Slack. You have to make sure that you find some, mechanism for doing that. And I think it's also important to be consistent. Maybe a consistent schedule, or a consistent set of expectations, or a consistent kind of way of interacting. Andy only knows me in a Zoom space. So if I'm a wildly different version of myself each week, that's going to be really confusing. Whereas if you're in person, you can actually get a better sense, I think, for the broader range of who somebody is. So trying to start with some consistency and some intentionality, and then expanding from there, I think, is one way that you can try to establish trust with somebody who's unknown to you and that you haven't met in person. And And that's actually one reason it's important to be yourself, because if you're not being yourself at all, then the other person's really not going to have a sense for who they're working with, and they won't get that valuable information, such as, oh, by the way, we're 3 hours earlier out here. If I don't share that information and I just try to accommodate the other person, they're really missing out on the opportunity not only to get to know me, but actually to have their own worldview expanded.
I think a lot of I agree with what you're saying. And I think a lot of the aspects of small talk and interpersonal communication that align with those 6 Ps, like one of the Ps is privacy, where, certain people are more or less willing to kind of show themselves, their full selves quickly, right? I think those align in virtual communication too. So for example, people I assume can see my background here, which is like entirely white, right? Like if I'm just against the wall. If I were in a meeting, I would never sit here, right? If I were in a meeting, I would sit in a location that has more sort of props and images in the background. And well, I have 2 dogs, and if you're going to end a Zoom call with me, there's a very large chance that they're going to enter the Zoom call. But this has become normative after COVID, right? And so for me, I like to actually incorporate these things. And you can see something in someone's background and say, oh, I see that coffee cup. That's interesting. What's that? Right? I think I said that to Melissa once. I think you're starting to use some of the very same techniques you might with small talk in the virtual environment, right? And you're starting to make connections, you're starting to personalize the relationship in a little way. And I think that those start to sow the seeds over time of creating that sense of trust.
You have a term in the book, trust currency and trust language. And I kind of like to know a little bit more about trust currency. I think that's interesting.
Yeah, sir. I mean, I'll chime in on that one. In certain cultures, uh, certain facets or values might be more or less important. So, for instance, in certain places, politeness or deference or respect might be critical sort of cultural values that are essential to unlocking trust. And you would try to display those, especially in your early interactions, right? Before you know the person, to start to show, again, it's about meta messages to show that I respect you, I respect your culture. And as you start to show those meta messages, I think that trust starts to become unlocked. And when trust becomes unlocked, at some point, the dynamic can actually change a lot. Someone can actually sort of like peel off their cultural self in a sense and start to be way more personal than you have expected before, right? That happened in some of the stories that we heard from executives, but that's kind of what we mean by unlocking trust. I would give you some examples if you want to.
I'd say a few other examples that come to mind for me are um, trying to use the other person's language if that is something that's viable in that situation. Of course, if you don't speak Spanish at all, you don't want to just launch into Spanish. But we have some situations in the book where executives were sent to another country and they really did practice delivering their introduction in the local language, even though maybe the operational language of that office was going to be English. That was a sign that they were making an effort. And I think it's really a gesture of goodwill. It's an olive branch that you're offering to the other party rather than an attempt to be perfect, because they weren't expecting this person to fluently speak their language, but it was a sign of respect. Another thing that you might do is find out about the other person's approach to time. In some cultures, arriving on time or even arriving a few minutes early is a really important way to show that you want to establish a trusting working relationship because it signals reliability and responsibility. In other cultures, though, allowing the conversation to breathe, maybe not being so restricted to the clock, giving that other person 5 extra minutes of your time so they can get their thought out and you can reflect on it together, that might be a way that you build the relationship. So there's no specific formula that you can follow, but asking yourself, is this likely to enhance the trust? Does this seem to be enhancing the trust? Is a good way to go about it.
And also, I'd say you can pick and choose. As Melissa said, there's no exact thing to do. It's just principles to follow. So one of the cases in the book, just one of many, was an American who went up to Canada in sort of French-speaking Canada, and almost all the employees were native French speakers. And by the way, by his own accord, he's terrible at languages. Like, he didn't study French in high school. I mean, he's really bad at languages, but he learned to deliver a speech in like really broken, butchered French. And people really respected him for it because he was really trying. He also got up at like 6 or 7 in the morning or something to play ice hockey with them. And that was, so what's interesting about that is that that's authentic. He was telling us how he actually likes sports and he skates, and he's from the northern part of the US. So that was something that fit with him. With someone else who doesn't skate and who doesn't like sports, that wouldn't be the arena to show this. But for him, it was, and he really got some points there. The irony, of course, is that he broke a rib, but I guess worthwhile.
You mentioned building teams and such, and you use a term cultural brokers, like that there might be certain people who you want on that team because they're a cultural broker. And I wonder if we could discuss a little bit about what are some of the characteristics of a successful cultural broker.
Yeah, so one of the things that a cultural broker can do is bring insight into the cultural logic of one party or the other. So say you have a team that has people from the UK and from Poland and from India. A cultural broker could be somebody who is from either of any of those cultures or who knows a lot about one of those cultures. But a cultural broker can also be somebody who has experience navigating cultural complexity, somebody who can bring their own experience of having been in culturally challenging situations before, and who can kind of point a path towards a resolution, even if they don't necessarily have expertise in any of those cultures.
Now, another part of the book, you go into what you call the finer points, and I appreciated this a lot. Curiosity. You mentioned the importance of having curiosity and viewing things with a wide-angle lens, and I really liked that term. So, how can you bring curiosity into your work in building intercultural relationships?
I can start on that one. Again, I think this is sort of like small talk. This is I don't think we were intending to write a chapter on curiosity, but we were sort of like pulled and tugged by our data to do it because everyone was mentioning it. And which is interesting, right? So what can you do to increase opportunities for curiosity, increase the chances? One is to make curiosity a requirement. Like, give yourself a goal that I'm making this up, one new food, I'm going to find one new place, and I'm going to meet one new person on this business trip or something like that, right? To actually make it a requirement. Not in a cultural context, but I used to do that with my kids at the grocery store, that we would go down each aisle, and the requirement when they were little was that they had to find one thing in that aisle they've never tried before, and we would get it, right? Sometimes it'd be things that were so random that they never ate, but it was with the idea of trying to instill curiosity. Surrounding yourself with curious people, I think that's really good. Sometimes you can ride the coattails of others who are curious, sort of like curiosity enablers. I also think that trying something new in a new culture, but something that aligns with something you're authentically interested in, sort of like the example we gave before about hockey or whatever it might be. It's like trying to find some blend between some innate interest that you have, whether it's an active or a latent interest, in something in the new culture. So I love sports. If you found me in Pakistan, I would be all over cricket. I don't know anything about cricket actually, but I've always been curious about it, and I love sports, and that would be my point of entry. But that would not be the point of entry for, I don't know, Melissa, maybe, because she is not into sports, right? So if you're sort of leveraging something that you're already authentically interested in, at least a category or a class of things, I think that can supercharge curiosity. Those are some thoughts. Melissa, any
Yeah,
other?
I would add that the curiosity also helps you in a number of ways. So if you're curious, you are recognizing that you don't have all the answers, first of all. So it puts you in a mindset where you're ready to learn. It also enhances your appreciation. If I'm being curious about a local culture, now I'm ready to experience it, but also maybe just enjoy it. I think one of the things that has been left out of the conversation for the past couple of years when we've been locked down into this COVID mindset and the recovery is that interacting with people from other cultures can be challenging, but it can also be exhilarating. It can be fun. It can be genuinely enlivening. It's amazing that we actually all get to have so many more global experiences than maybe our great grandparents did. And when you're curious, it allows you to tap into that. It's not just that you have to accomplish the work, you're also potentially having this really interesting life experience. And when you approach the other person with that kind of demeanor and that kind of energy, often that is a way that you can kind of get off on the right track. Being curious isn't necessarily going to guarantee a positive and successful outcome for your negotiation, but if you've arrived at that moment, you've been curious about the city that you were in, you've tried a new food, you've had an interesting experience so far, you're likely to bring that mindset to that interaction. And if you're curious, you can continue to recognize that the other person may have information that you don't have, and that puts you in a position where you can learn and you can grow and you can possibly open up opportunities that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
Well, one of the things I really liked about when you looked at curiosity was you did that thought exercise afterwards, and one of the questions to the reader was, think how it feels when someone expressed curiosity about you. And it really is a nice way of kind of driving home that, yeah, that kind of builds rapport, because you're not always expecting that.
There was a guy that we interviewed who said that he purposely structures a free day before he goes on an international trip, and he asks his hosts to suggest things that he might see in the city beforehand, and he actually goes and does them or some of them. And what a great way to sort of create opportunities for curiosity and small talk the next day that are real, not superficial small talk, but like about something like that he's genuinely curious about and that is showing interest in that person's city or culture. And people often take a lot of pride in their cities and cultures. And that's a great way to start to win trust, not in some sort of devious, opportunistic way, but it's actually hopefully an enjoyable, authentic way.
Well, we've talked also a lot about authenticity, um, but you also have a section of the book on the internal work that you need to do to build successful relationships. I'm wondering if you could give us a few pointers on the internal work that you find helpful.
One of the things that we acknowledge in this book, and I've certainly experienced in my own life, maybe Andy has as well, is that it can actually be quite frustrating and challenging to be in cultural situations where, for one reason or another, you just don't seem to be clicking. You might experience difficult emotions, like you might feel resentful of the situation. You might feel that you're not being understood despite all of your best efforts. And we wanted to really recognize that, of course, even in our own cultures where we know the cultural logic and we know the kind of cultural code, we still experience all these things. And so even when we do our best in another culture, we're not going to be able to escape the fact that sometimes we just don't click with another person or we don't fully understand what's going on. So we want to normalize the fact, first of all, that that happens. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're a failure. And it doesn't mean that the negotiation or the project is a lost cause. What often I think can help is just to stop and recognize the fact that it is hard and that there is a lot going on. And then ask yourself what you want to do about it. Ask yourself, what are my options? What have I tried? What do I maybe still not know? And what do I want to do from here? I think, Andy, did you have anything you wanted to add on that point?
No, I mean, I guess the only thing I would add, and I agree, that it can be sort of, you know, psychologically challenging to sort of sink into another culture where you might feel lost and you might feel outside your comfort zone, let's say. Um, I think it's wise to try to cultivate a learning orientation as opposed to a performing, or well, I mean, maybe not opposed to, in addition to a performing orientation. Sometimes easier said than done for those of us who are very performance oriented. But I think a learning orientation can can actually intersect with your previous question, James, which is it can make you curious, right? It can make you curious so that the feelings you have inside end up being sort of like, in addition to feeling maybe uncomfortable, that might be sort of interesting information. You start to be curious about, well, wait a second, why am I outside my comfort zone here? Why does it feel this way? Are there do I have options here? Like, I mean, you start to develop curiosity, and I think that's really important, to try to cultivate that, is, maybe somewhat of an antidote to any negative experiences you have internally.
And I guess one other thing I would quickly add is that it's very likely that the other person is feeling many of those things as well. We're often focused on our own experience and our own goals and in our own objectives, especially in a negotiation context. But the other person may be having just as much difficulty trying to figure us out. They may also be confused about why their own typical style doesn't seem to be working, why they're not getting anywhere with us. And recognizing that, I think, can be really humbling, that we're the difficult person possibly for the other party as well. And that can kind of help us to think about how we might want to be part of the solution and collaborate with the other party to get to the result that we're looking for.
I think also the reason we keep mentioning authenticity maybe, is it's sort of aligned with that negotiation idea of interests versus positions, right? In the classic, getting to yes idea, where positions are more of a surface level type of thing, and the interests are sort of underneath it. I think that, the behavioral analogy is how we act, how we accommodate to local norms and so on, especially early on. That's the more surface level. But building trust and a real connection, which is critical for relationships or for negotiation, happens at a little bit of a deeper level. That level where you actually can feel that you're more yourself and that the other person's more themselves, and you show that you respect them, that you value them, that you value the relationship, and that you value yourself, right? That as you start to develop those, as the relationships and you start to develop those qualities, I think that that's really critical for anything, and especially negotiations.
Great. Well, we're getting to the point where I would like to turn over some of the questions to our global audience, because it's always interesting to hear how our thoughts are received globally. And we have a few questions, and I encourage anyone to put their questions in the question and answer category as we go along. So one of the questions in front of us is, can you discuss some real-world implications of poor cross-cultural relationships in business negotiations, and how does your book address these? So any horror stories that you came across?
Let's see. Definitely not horror stories. I mean, the cross-cultural world is littered with examples of sort of misperception, miscommunication, failed negotiations, major faux pas, that result from differences. That's sort of the typical paradigm in the cross-cultural world. We decided to take a different tack, certainly acknowledging that these disasters can happen, but we were more focused on the positive, on what are the conditions under which you can successfully build a relationship across cultures. Be aware of differences, but not obsessed with differences. A metaphor that we used a lot was gardening. The idea that when you're planting a garden, part of what you want to do is get rid of the bad stuff. In other words, the analogy would be the mistakes, right? So that would be the weeds. But just getting rid of the weeds doesn't make a garden grow. You need to actually nourish the garden with positive aspects. And the analogy in the relationship would be that you need to find commonalities, create connections, and build trust, and so on. And so that was more the focus of our book, as opposed to like these sort of like classic disasters. But so I know I'm sort of skirting the question, but it wasn't really the focus of the book. Melissa, any thoughts on that?
I do have one cautionary tale that comes to mind. There was a really interesting case where there was a virtual team, and in order to try to cultivate a sense of trust, everybody on the team who was in the US and many European countries, Brazil and India and China, they were invited to share something about themselves. They were invited to share a picture of their hobbies. And one of the Americans who lived in a rural part of the country posted a picture of his hunting trophy. This was a really important part of his background, and he wanted to share it. Unbeknownst to him, this was very offensive to some of the other people in the group. And what happened was not that I think he had done something wrong, but the problem was that the team didn't have any way to resolve this. And so they sort of they became frozen, and then nobody wanted to share anything anymore. So what I think, rather than, like Andy said, rather than trying to avoid the mistakes, I think what's important is to recognize that probably inevitably at some point you are going to be the one who posts the picture that maybe people don't know what to do with, or you're the one who's going to feel angry and offended. If you recognize that this is somewhat inevitable, you can decide that what you want to do when this happens is talk to the other person and decide what you want to do about it. And I think that was the piece that was missing in the situation, and that is often missing. I think we stop at the moment sometimes where we feel that somebody has done something wrong, and we act like it can't be resolved. So I would encourage teams, especially if you're all coming from different places, to recognize that you can actually then have a follow-up conversation, and you can work through it in many cases. And just making the mistake doesn't have to be the end of the road.
Can I just chime in one more comment on that as well? That I think that there's a myth that that building relationships in a foreign culture is mainly about avoiding mistakes. And our perspective is different. I think that the reality for us is that building relationships in another culture is really about the process of creating a sense of trust and rapport so that mistakes don't matter as much, and can even potentially be learning opportunities. So that it's just a shift in perspective.
So how does that impact like handling disagreements so they don't escalate into conflict? I mean, what are some skills that you could offer up there?
Yeah, we have a chapter on that. And it's an important chapter. And I think the bottom line in that chapter that we discovered from our research is that the key again is to find a way in the context of that conversation to demonstrate three things: that I value you, I value myself, and I value the relationship. So I value you, I respect you, I really do respect you, but I also value myself. I have needs, I have interests, and those are important for us together to take into account. And I also value the relationship. And if you can keep those three, if you're juggling those three balls and you can keep them in the air, metaphorically speaking, I think that that's going to be critical in terms of resolving a conflict. Melissa, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, it might actually help sometimes to just acknowledge that there might be a disagreement. I think sometimes we're afraid that if we acknowledge there's a disagreement, then we might sort of lose control of the moment, but actually recognizing that we're not in control of it and that we just maybe need to have a conversation, we can say, I think we might not be on the same page with this point. Could you tell me a little bit more about your perspective, or ask what you're missing? Often you can, maybe there isn't even a disagreement, it was just a misunderstanding about a situation, but handling it doesn't have to be direct all the time. But I think when there's a lot of confusion, it can be helpful just to say, I think we might not be seeing eye to eye. Let's talk about this. Can be really, really helpful, as opposed to just trying to avoid it because you're afraid of having a cross-cultural disagreement.
Now, I should also add that there's some cultures and some people who are extremely indirect in their communication style and will not have this sort of more straightforward conversation that we're implying. And those cues can be difficult to decipher sometimes, especially you might not even realize you're in a disagreement necessarily. So that can add complexity to the situation as well. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it can add some complexity.
We also have a question. In what way can it work or backfire to bring up cultural diversity and similarities as a topic in the beginning of relationship building? Any experience or advice?
I'm not normally just talking about culture as such. So if say I met Andy at a networking event, I probably wouldn't say, well, here's the information about my culture. Now tell me about your culture. Now let's see how we're similar and how we're different. But I might notice he's having a coffee, and then I might say, oh, I I see you have coffee. I'm desperate for coffee. Where did you get this coffee? Now it turns out that we have this coffee in common. So I think the distinction for me and Andy is that we're thinking about the cultural similarities and differences possibly in our own heads, but we're not necessarily trying to enumerate them with the other person as a starting point for conversation.
I think it also depends on the sort of way that the relationship organically evolves, and with certain people in certain circumstances, culture actually ends up being a point of learning, almost a point of joking potentially, as the relationship develops and you can become sort of more comfortable with each other and develop that sense of trust. Someone might say, oh my gosh, that was my German self coming out again, I apologize. Like I have a colleague who's German, and she'll often surface that, am I being too American here? Like so like it can become part of like the sort of like in-group language of your relationship, which is idiosyncratic to your particular relationship, which of course is some sort of organic original thing. It's not in no single relationship relationships are like fingerprints, they're all different. So it's hard to have a hard and fast rule, other than those broader aspects that we talked about. Like, I value you, I value myself, and I value the relationship. Those are really key, but the way that those things play out can vary.
Oh, we have another question. Are there any areas in intercultural relationship building that you believe require further research or exploration? Anything you left out of the book that maybe you would touch on, or things that you would go deeper?
uh Melissa, I have some thoughts,
I
but
mean, there's so much more
yeah.
that we could explore. We had to restrict ourselves really to the length of the book, but go ahead, Andy.
uh, um I find that I would like to look into um, very complex, thorny issues that are not as easily understood. Um, you know, Issues that involve more than two people. Like, this book was really about a relationship, which typically in our examples implies two people. Though we talked about teams as well. I'm very interested in extremely complex situations where people are from multiple cultures, multiple backgrounds, maybe don't even maybe even don't identify from a given culture, but see themselves as cosmopolitans. Like, I think the world is trending in that direction. And I think that would be really interesting to look at. But there's so many, so many examples.
And we have a question that's looking at, like, how do you decide who's going to lead your negotiation team? And it's kind of in the context of negotiating with a negotiating partner from Japan. Should you have a man be the person representing your group, or someone who's junior in experience to the team leader? Like, how do you select maybe the appropriate person for a certain negotiation team? I mean, we talked a little bit about cultural brokers, but does it matter, like, would you select one person for, say, a Japanese group, or one person for a German group? Would that matter?
So I'll say a few. And feel free to chime in. What's the context? Is there any context in the question?
There isn't much of a context, but kind of looking also back to the 1970s, and is there anything that's different today? Like, would you would you necessarily have to have a senior person, or could you have a more junior person? Or
I think that what would be really critical is to try to do some research and due diligence into the background of the people that you're going to be working with in that new culture. Because if you use culture as a heuristic, you could get into trouble, right? Because There are, as we talked about before, there are important regional differences. There are urban rural differences. There are organizational cultural differences. There are professional cultural differences. Is this someone in the tech world? Is this someone in the banking world? Is this someone in academics? And then there's the backgrounds of the specific people that you're working with. And so once you get a finer grained sense of what the real specific context is in that new place, forget the word culture, in that new place and who those people are, then I think you have to start to try to figure out what makes the most sense for you. If it's a culture where it's a very traditional culture and they really respect hierarchy and so on and so forth, then you'll have to figure out who on your team makes the most sense to represent your group or your organization. But then again, you might also start to think about cultural savviness, cultural intelligence, cultural, like who on our team is really the kind of the best in these types of situations, who has sort of that cultural radar and is really interpersonally savvy. And what if that person's not the same person as the more senior? Then you're starting to make you're starting to make sort of, and also who's willing to do it. Like, I mean, that's important too. So I think it's a very, very hard question to answer in the abstract. I think the only sort of general advice I would say is really understand the context you're going into.
Oh, we
I
also
would add, oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead, go.
I would just add that you're negotiating with them, but they're also negotiating with you. So your job is not to necessarily try to guess what they want to see, but to think about what kinds of strategies you might deploy. And so having a variety of people on the negotiating team who can each bring something different and valuable to the table would give you some flexibility in that setting.
So if a relationship for some reason starts out bad, any advice on how to get it back on track?
I would try, I mean, it depends, right? I might try a different context or setting, completely switch it up, go out to a bar, go drinking, have dinner. You know what I mean? Like some opportunity like that, that's just completely different from where you are, might unlock something potentially, potentially have a break. I mean, it's hard to, those are some immediate thoughts, but yeah. And if something's intractable, then you can oftentimes switch up participants potentially. But Melissa, any advice on that one?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I had mentioned earlier can work in this context too. You can just say, look, I think we got off on the wrong foot last time. I'd like to get to know you a little bit better. Or you might not address it at all, and you might just ask if you could have a chat with them because you want to get their insights on the situation. Now you're putting them in the role of an expert. Now you have the opportunity to hear a little bit more about what they saw. That might give you some of the information that you need if you're wanting to pivot your approach with them.
Also, I would, as I'm thinking here, I would also check your assumption that the relationship got off on a bad foot. They might, that's an interpretation of behavior, but your interpretation might be wrong, especially in a cross-cultural context.
We've talked about virtual work and building relationships on Zoom and such, but do you think with this virtual work, it will actually decrease cultural fluency because people don't have to physically go somewhere?
It's a good research question.
Because then the other
There's a
question someone
dissertation.
else has is also, why haven't you gotten together? Why,
It
so
wasn't intentional, but
We
there,
almost did. I was in LA, but I was with 10 friends from college and it just wasn't going to happen.
and I was on the other side of LA, which was, several hours. I think, Andy and I also work with many people who are from Europe and from Asia in the context of another certification that we have. And just because we're not physically in their cultures doesn't mean we're not getting a sort of a flavor of their culture. The communication styles, the way that people respond to emails is very different. We see different patterns with people who, what they choose to share, how they engage, their positive emotion that they're bringing to their communication. And so I guess I would say, you know, you're missing out on the opportunity to get a bigger picture on the local culture if you're not physically going there. But I wouldn't say it's true that you're not experiencing their culture at all. You're still experiencing at least a version of that person's culture. If you're working with somebody from Poland or somebody from China, many things about them are likely still influenced by the culture. You just might not have the opportunity to have the fun part where you're immersing yourself in seeing the bigger world that they come from.
Can I sort of double click on that too? Because so we work very closely with someone from Poland. I've never been to Poland, but I have seen her house. I've seen her daughter. I've seen the way that she interacts with her daughter. I've seen photos of the food that she likes to cook. When she goes on a little vacation, oftentimes we'll share screens, look on a map, and with Google Maps, you can actually like see the street and see the restaurant and see the place where she stayed. I see when she has a when she moves, let's say she does like a little break. I learn about the holidays. I learn about the meaning of the holidays. I learn that, you know, I learn about the rhythm and pacing of work.
Mm-hmm.
I learn about, I mean, I could keep going on, and I've never been to Poland, but you know, it's both through online, I mean, real time online, but also asynchronous. We use a Slack channel, and we also use email, and we share images, we share photos, and you develop a relationship over time like that. And I haven't met her in person either. I'd love to. I really want to go to Poland to check it out, but I don't know if I believe that it's that you can't learn about culture and become more culturally sophisticated online. You know, I don't know if that's, I don't know if I agree with it. It's an interesting question though.
Well, let me just say that brings us to time. And I think I've learned a lot today about intercultural relationships on this Zoom call. And I think our audience did as well. So Melissa and Andy, just really want to thank you for leading us through this, and just want to remind everyone, the book is called Forging Bonds in a Global Workforce. And I'd turn it back over to Nicole. Here comes the Zoom mic.
Yeah, well, very quickly, thank you so much to Andy and Melissa for this insightful conversation, and to all of our participants who joined in today. We look forward to seeing you at another PON event. We're actually actively scheduling our summer session. Today is actually Harvard commencement on campus, and we are actively looking to what happens at the close of the academic year. So our next event will be with David Hoffman on June 24th, and we are scheduling events for July and August. I will also add one last note, as I kicked off the program by introducing our wonderful moderator, James Kerwin. I didn't mention at the time that he is actually our outgoing assistant director, because he is moving on to new adventures at the end of June. And so this is an occasion to just say a huge thank you to James Kerwin for everything that he has done for PON in his time here. You have made an incredible mark on this place, James, and we're so lucky to have had you. So thank you to James, thank you to Andy and Melissa, and to all of our participants, and we look forward to seeing you all at a later date. Be well.